Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Buddhist philosophy, Zen Buddhism, and particularly Joshu, known in Japan as Joshu. He is originally from Tang, China, like Linji, and just like Linji is known in Japan as Rinzai, Joshu is known in Japan as Joshu, and just as I have been saying Chinese Chan more as the Japanese name Zen, I will be referring to Joshu most often here as by his Japanese name, even though he was Chinese, as Joshu. So now that we've covered Linji in several talks, and I did go through that slowly because it's important for all of this here, we're now going to turn to Joshu, who lived sometime, it is said, he must have been about 112, because he lived sometime around 778 to 897, they say. Linji only lived half that long, less, but that means that Linji lived about in the second half of Joshu's life, abouts. So Joshu is my favorite of the Zen masters, but we have worked slowly through Linji because I'm going to give a talk on Joshu here, my favorite Zen master, possibly the most hilarious and most of the stand-up comedian of the Zen masters, and so an original central inspiration. But then we're going to do a talk on central cases of the Blue Cliff Record, and then another talk on the Gateless Gate. And that will pretty much finish up the talks on Zen and Buddhist philosophy that I will be doing for this semester, given that we have somewhat run out of time, and given that I will continue to, be putting the talks out as we continue to work through everything as we go on into the next semester and on into the shining future, all of us together here. So, while Linji's sermons are the central source of understanding the puzzling practice of interviews between masters and students, the Koan practices and study, Linji does not appear often in the central Koan cases that are the focus of study. Rather, it is Joshu, the very Taoist Zen stand-up comedian, who gave the Zen tradition many of its favorite and famous cases to study for centuries, far more than any other master. This is why we study Joshu as the last of the Tang masters, even though he was a generation either overlapping with or before Linji. And he is off the lineage, but right off the lineage of Linji as a branching off, right beforehand. And then we're going to look at the cases of Dharma combat from the two central Koan collections, the Blue Cliff Record, written around 1125, and the Gateless Gate, written in 1228, compiled in those years, around 200 and then 300 years after Linji and Joshu had passed. Joshu and Linji both separate off very much at Mazu. Mazu, who is the first to possibly use the word Chan or Zen as one word to describe the school. I have a talk on that, a couple of talks several ago. Hey, buddy. One of my cats here. They're on the, on the shelfless shelves over here. So, Mazu leads to Nansen, and Mazu had two very famous students and followers. Nansen, originally Nanchuan, I will be referring to Nanchuan, his Chinese name, as Nansen, the Japanese name, which is also simpler, again, for my English self to pronounce. And Mazu also had Baizang, who led to Huangbo. Now that was actually the pulling of the nose story in The Duck Flown Away. And then Huangbo had a student by the name of Linji. So we were just covering Baizang to Huangbo to Linji, and so Mazu had another student by the name of Nansen, who is off to the side of Baizang, Huangbo, and Linji, who himself had a student named Joshu. We will call them Nansen, having a student named Joshu. So Joshu's place in the lineage is puzzling because he lives before Linji and overlapping with him, but is not in the line between Mazu and Linji. Remember, the Buddha holds up a lotus, and that's very important for the Zen folks to connect themselves in a lineage and a line back to the Buddha. But Mazu had the two students of the famous masters Baizang and Nanchuan, And the koan literature was, as mentioned, written to show two things. First, that the silent transmission Linji spoke about passed from the Buddha, Bodhidharma, and India by patriarch to patriarch, the silent transmission, to the Song China house of Linji. But the second purpose is that the teachings flourished across the land, leading to masters sprouting up in multiple places, such that it comes of itself and of nature, spontaneously. Joshu is the greatest master of the final 10th generation, recorded in the Transmission of the Lamp Koan collection, written around 1004, just before the House of Linji came to dominate the intellectual scene of Song China. So the Transmission of the Lamp was also after both Linji and Joshu, was 100 years after both were dead. While Joshu was not of the House of Linji, his brilliance was used, clearly, by Linji's followers to cement the position of the southern Chan of Huineng and Mazu, which Joshu and Linji share in common. So it definitely seems, and the reason I am presenting Joshu after Linji, is because now we are going to be covering in detail, which again we kind of do back and forth with covering Bodhidharma and Huineng. We are now covering in detail the major koan collections and cases, and the record of Joshu as one of these, as the cementing of the House of Linji, after going through his sermons, and their famous koan literature cases, which is a new style, again, of sacred text and philosophy text they are creating for world history at this time. So when a monk asked Master Joshu, "Who is the patriarch of this land?" he replied, "Bodhidharma has come here, so now we are all patriarchs." The monk asked, "What generation in the Chan lineage are you?" And Joshu said, "I do not fall into any position," which is sort of true and not true. He is actually helping cement the position, but he is not in a middleman position passing down the lineage to Linji or his house. The monk asked, "Then where are you now?" And Joshu said, "Inside your ears." I love that line. There are several lines of Joshu I quote all the time. Where are you? I'm inside your ears right now. I'm inside your mind. My voice was in your ears, and now I am inside your eyes and your head. Yes, doing a little dance. So like Linji, Joshu speaks as if we are all part of the same mind that moves in and out of our mouths and our ears, and the holes of your face, and thus do not keep particular positions entirely to ourselves. When he says, "I do not fall into any position," that's also, he falls into any position freely, a barrel, an ox, whatever, so he doesn't fall into any position entirely. This is also like subjective transitional truth is not objective fixed truth, but it is truth. Joshu is very much a holy fool, an archetypal one, a trickster found throughout human cultures, and it is debated how much he was inspired by Taoist sages. This is again another major piece of evidence. Not only does Huineng quote and Mazu quote they quote Taoist texts and Chuang-Tzu, but Joshu, not Chuang-Tzu, the Zen master, is himself from the stone bridge and named for the site that was popular for Taoist hermits who sometimes camped out under the stone bridge of the town for which the town was named, and Joshu is named. Joshu, meaning stone bridge. And the bridge is a famous place where Taoist hermits and bums used to live and camp out. Kind of like, unfortunately, we have growing tent cities under overpasses nowadays. Joshu quotes Chuang-Tzu and the Taoist patriarch more than once. He famously tells one student in a famous koan case, "Ships cannot sail where the water is too shallow," implying that a shallow mind doesn't have the space for grander understandings and the air for that grander siren. Both Joshu and Linji lived and taught where Taoism was particularly popular. During the Tang Dynasty, when different schools of Buddhism that Chan is competing with and eventually going to rise above, but also Taoism is getting official patronage of emperors and empresses, etc. So you have here that many and noble houses. So many of Joshu's koan cases sound like a Taoist sage who has specifically disregarded human conventions and expectations to live beyond all borders and boundaries. I mentioned with Linji, Joshu, Puhua, and Linji all interact strangely, come in and out of each other's lives in the records, because there were clearly at least these three strange guys who either knew each other or were all similar at the same time. Many of Joshu's koan cases sound like jokes, and sometimes Joshu's final word is simply laughter. Again, I don't know how much I'm missing cultural context or how much these really come off like jokes. It's hard for me to tell, and it may be hard for people to tell in general. His record is by far the most entertaining to read, though Linji's comes close. Again, we went over all of the great lines at length in Linji. So Nanchuan, aka Nansen, kills the cat. This Joshu, and then the reason again we cover him along here right after Linji is because the two of the most famous koan cases are, as already mentioned, and these actually come along later in the Zen tradition, is what is the sound Hakuin of Japan was particularly fascinated by, and that's one of the reasons why, because it was Japan that's very fascinated by the two, we very much know, and many people know of, what is the sound of one hand clapping, and there's several responses to that are canonical responses, actually, that are taught by different schools. And then there's also, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound, if nobody's around? Those are two of the famous ones from later Zen and Japan. However, in the Song dynasty, when Chan Buddhism, which starts in the Tang with Linji, Joshu, and others, and then briefly between the Tang and the Song, the generals who were in the power vacuum were into the countercultural Buddhism of Taoist-like Chan, that Nansen killing the cat, and my apologies for talking about killing a cat, especially in front of my cat beasts, who again, I guess they split, no pun intended. Again, well, there's two of them, so they can do that painlessly. They took off, so thankfully I won't have to burn their ears with such seething words. But Nansen, forgive me, killing the cat, and then Joshu saying, does a dog have Buddha nature? Joshu happens to be involved in two of the most central Zen cases, which were the things discussed plenty in the Song Imperial Court of China. Now, the Tang was a very Renaissance era for China. Then you had a brief period, and then the Song was a time when you have printing turning even into movable block printing and gunpowder going on and fireworks, and people are China is rising up and having its Renaissance very much culminating in the Tang into the Song. And so as the Song court is a new, fascinating, interesting head of a society, you have Joshu being discussed in two different cases, and the House of Linji is framing all this in these texts. So in one of the most studied and discussed koan cases in Zen, the 14th case of the Gateless Gate, the monks of the eastern and western halls were fighting over who owned a stray cat that many of the monks had been feeding. By the way, as we have been covering all of these Zen masters, we have actually been covering many of the cases found in the Blue Cliff Record and the Gateless Gate, but we haven't been mentioning them as we have, which is why when we get to the Blue Cliff Record and Gateless Gate, we're actually going to somewhat pass over and skip over several of the cases we've already covered, in fact. Including, again, in passing, we are going to cover this more right here with Joshu, these central cases. So, I believe the dog, Buddha nature, is the second case of the Blue Cliff Record. It's later in my notes. I'll know me when I get to there. But the cat is the 14th case of the Gateless Gate and one of the central talked about cases of Song China. And thus human history and human philosophy. So the monks of the eastern and western halls were fighting over who owned a stray cat that many of the monks had been feeding. The cat may not know it, but splitting the sangha, this is implied, and actually it's not stated in the text at all, but in Linji, and I mentioned at the time, that splitting the sangha is actually a very serious crime. It's like killing the Buddha or splitting the Buddha, splitting the head off the Buddha. So technically even having multiple sects of Zen or houses of Zen or schools of Buddhism could be interpreted as a serious crime. That is part of the background, which we already got with Linji, which Buddhist monks and nuns would already understand as they are reading and contemplating this case, which the average audience coming to this case for the first time would not understand. So upset by the fact that the monks of the Eastern and Western Hall, and by the way, it has also been said that, and clearly shown, the hall is actually arranged like the head is the master's hall, and you go in to visit the master for koan practice in the master's hall. You then have the main lecture hall is kind of like the lungs and the chest, and the eastern and western halls are like the left and right arm of the body. So it is also symbolic that killing a cat is using your arm to strike and separate, like the eastern and western halls, like the right and left arms separate. That is also going on here. That's not obvious, but that also is subtle meaning happening. So Nansen holds up the cat, and he says, if any of you monks can say a turning word, a turning word is a good phrase, that's going to come up a lot, you can save this cat. Perhaps attempting to teach them impermanence in a rather unorthodox fashion for a Mahayana Buddhist, because Mahayana Buddhists actually take vows of nonviolence. None of the monks knew what to say, so Nanchuan split the cat in two. My apologies, and also, this is him committing a crime according to Mahayana Buddhism. So what's going on here that actually a Zen person might understand, and we can pause right here and say, there's something swimming around here very clearly which somebody might understand that might swim right by us, that Joshu clearly picks up on here. The cat has inadvertently, unknown to the cat, split the Sangha. So in revenge, almost, Nansen himself decides to violate Buddhism and kill an innocent creature. Well, perhaps not an innocent creature, but again, is the creature innocent or guilty here if it's a cat that doesn't know what it's doing? And the monks are the community divided. So the monks loving the cat are divided against each other and angry at each other, and they've been divided whether or not they know they are dividing the Sangha themselves over the cat. So actually all of them are somewhat guilty. So Nansen actually strangely commits a crime like everyone is doing. So you could say he's the worst, or you could say he's just mirroring them in splitting the cat like the community in two. But technically, if there was a cat who ever was cut, we are going to get to Gotei, I love the end him slicing the finger off of the kid, which is really vicious if it ever happens, so hopefully this is symbolism. And with all of this stuff, I have to say, the Buddha is a warrior's son who uses a lot of militant imagery, along with Mahavir and the Jains, as we had so long ago in the talks. They use very militant imagery for gaining enlightenment and peace of mind. And they've been playing on that in Indian culture the whole time. And then we also have here in Chinese Buddhism, the Zen are getting very Taoist trickster, but also they're getting even beyond Taoist tricksters. They are like this would be, even beyond a Taoist trickster, would often not like directly harm an animal right in front of everybody else. So this is very odd and very unorthodox. This is, again, not me trying to make it easy or hard. This is why the Song court was sitting there being like, why would a Buddhist monk kill a cat? And here comes more. But that all is going on and would be somewhat subtly implied and would be known via Buddhist concepts and culture. What's up, buddy? My cat is attempting to split something that I have tacked up on the wall, and will say nothing else about the Lankavatara Sutra and the impermanence of all murals, yes, or all wall hangings, as clearly are cats. So, and cats make things impermanent themselves, yes, and split my Sangha in two. So none of the monks know what to say, so he splits the cat. So later, Joshu returns from a task outside, so he was out doing things for the monastery, possibly with the lay community, going and grabbing something, doing something. And so Nansen, which, funny enough, he was outside the monastery, which technically means, if we're subtly paying attention, Joshu leaving the monastery, he already split the Sangha a little bit by being outside and apart from everybody else and not seeing what was going on along with everybody else. Later, he returns, and Nansen tells him what had happened, as if he has to, well, again, because he didn't know what happened. He is split. So Joshu takes off one of his sandals, puts it on top of his head, and just walks out without another word. And Nan says, if only he had been here, he could have saved that cat. Now, I've already said too much between the lines, but again, I do argue they want you to somewhat understand this, and they would expect people to have certain understandings if they know what's going on somewhat. Even then, it remains wonderfully open like a puzzle. According to legend, recall, all of these people would know when Bodhidharma's grave was opened, only a single straw sandal was found. A lower dead form empty of higher living meaning. A dead object like a corpse without life. And a shoe is like the material on the bottom of your living foot. the living silent teaching outside the transmission according to the lineage, the living inner meaning rather than the dead outer form or words. Like the face we all have as opposed to the inner life. Nansen killed a conscious being to preserve Chan Mahayana Buddhism, breaking the literal laws and vows to preserve the unity of the Sangha. And in response, Joshu seems to be, it could easily be understood, as he could be doing 3 or 4 things, but he is definitely pretending and mimicking Bodhidharma, carrying the silent teaching. Sandals are often quite quiet, unless they're noisy and have too much to say. Shut up. Carrying the silent teaching from the Buddha, from India to China. And what happens if you bring Buddhism from India to China with Bodhidharma? What is Bodhidharma doing, kids, when he leaves the Buddha and Buddhism in India? Technically, Bodhidharma was not there for the Buddha to hold up the lotus in the official version, because Bodhidharma came far later. But when Bodhidharma leaves India and comes to China with a sandal on his head and a silent transmission, what is Bodhidharma doing? Bodhidharma, by creating Zen Chan Buddhism, split the Sangha. And that is awesome. It can mean all sorts of other things, of course, but it certainly implies that. And that is some interesting play with all of the themes that we've had so far, and it can certainly go on to mean lots of that. And my apologies to my cat, who's right here. My cat is right here. Here's the little Leo. He is my snow lion. He is brother of the tiger. Yes, we must tame the tiger. And Leo roars at me all day long. He has the lion's roar, such that the jackal's and or fox spirit's head split open, and now he wants to split. So yes, I was just showing you that I have a whole cat integral. I actually have 2 of them. And maybe I could combine them to form a superior cat being in their final form. There he is. Yes. Anyway, he'll dabble in the sunlight there and possibly merge with it in the image. So, let's see here. So, Nansen says that guy could have saved that cat. And here you have, because one guy commits a crime for somebody else, though, he's like, okay, then the whole thing was a crime to begin with. Our whole thing. So when Joshu walks away, he is splitting the Sangha. Of course, he was already outside. He goes back to splitting the Sangha, oddly enough. Like the Sangha is already split. Like Bodhidharma did when he left India, the land of the Buddha, and brought the silent transmission of Chan to China. Like the cat unwittingly did when it wandered into Nanchuan's monastery. Nansen, put the unity of the community over the unity of the cat, so Joshu put the silent transmission of Bodhidharma over the unity of the community, splitting from Nansen as Bodhidharma did from India. Which also, the hilarious thing is that perhaps Joshu is suggesting that Bodhidharma is much like a cat, as well as Zen itself, an inquisitive, mischievous being without a particular purpose that wanders inexplicably eastward, causing problems. It also suggests, and this is again, plays within plays, it suggests that when he walks away, what is he implying the master is? He is implying that the master is the Buddha in India, that the monastery is India, and he's going to split and go to China, even though they're all in China. So funny enough, he's actually complimenting the master, and that's part of the subtlety here. By pretending to be Bodhidharma cluelessly wandering around with a sandal on his head out of India, he's actually implying that Nansen much is like the Buddha holding up a lotus when he held up the cat before splitting it open. That, again, is quite the lotus flower in the morning and is kind of, again, very interesting and plays on things that are played on things that are played on. This, again, is not ruining it for me. I think there could be all sorts of things there, but again, if you're staring at these things for years, and if you have read the text we've talked through, then one of these things would show up, and another of these things, and another of these things, and then looking through these angles, more and more and more should be progressively revealed about what is being subtly suggested here and there, and you feel it out by feeling out the feelings and the hidden and the manifest in the situation between all of these characters and patriarchal figures who are models to follow, like following Joshu with a sandal on his head out the door. So did Nansen kill the cat, or is the story fictional and simply symbolic? Let's hope so. Again, that's illegal in this state I'm sitting in. Did he break the rule of nonviolence, placing the unity of the monastery over the unity of the cat? Or is the story merely instructional, an imaginary example somebody made up to teach Chan that became part of the record and legend? There are two similar violent incidents in the Chan records that may or may not have happened, which monks and masters puzzled over. According to one account, the second Chinese Chan patriarch, we cut out on this. We did not mention it, passed over this in silence. The second Chan patriarch, Huike, cut off his left arm supposedly to show his devotion to Bodhidharma, which is like splitting himself, that he was serious. He cut off his left arm. Like, say, the Eastern as opposed to the Western Hall, or something like that. So, the second patriarch, when a monk asked Joshu, after Joshu is later a master in his own place, in the record of Joshu, he says, the second patriarch cut off his arm. What sort of an act is that? He's asking a guy who's been involved in violent incidents. And Joshu said he was throwing his whole self into it. Which is, again, almost like some kind of joke. The third incident does not involve Joshu. It's Jusi, which is a strangely similar name, but cutting off a monk's finger. Another funny and terrible story. It's actually hilarious, but it's also awful. So funny enough, these are kind of Looney Tunes violent jokes that we'll examine in the Gateless Gate. I won't mention all of that now, but again, hopefully a kid never got his finger cut off, and then a hilarious circumstances followed, and hopefully cat never died, and hopefully, again, the second patriarch didn't actually cut off his left arm right there in order to distract Bodhidharma from wall sitting. It isn't, Bodhidharma was just staring at a wall. He wouldn't even pay attention to the guy, so he cut off his left arm to be like, no, pay attention to me, Dad. Again, he was throwing his whole self into it in spite of the arm, and hopefully that wouldn't have happened. Otherwise, he would have just straight up bled out, and that would have been the end of the lineage much. So the second case, though, that Joshu is most famous for is not that one, but that he's throwing his whole self into it with the second example. But the second case that's most famous of Joshu, that is one of the most central koan cases, period, which again, Linji tells you how to understand these, but Joshu holds the central place of the koan cases Zen Master record, is, does a dog have Buddha nature? Mahayana Buddhists teach that all of our reality, including all sentient beings, have a common conscious Buddha nature. Buddha Dhatu in the Pali. The common mind, which Linji calls the true sage of no rank. Bodhidharma said that the highest thing is the self, but the widest thing is the mind and its wisdom. The Buddha nature we all share in common. A monk once asked Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? Possibly unclear on the basic Mahayana concept of all sentient beings, but perhaps he is trying to tempt the master, it definitely seems, into answering a yes or no question as yes or no. And Joshu avoids saying yes or no by saying wu, famously. In Japanese, mu, which means not no, but sort of not. As in no, as in not that. As in empty or meaningless, or not that, or nothing, or like, no, nothing, that's nothing. So he doesn't say no, a dog doesn't have Buddha nature, but he implies basically like your question is nothing itself. That's not important, whether or not a dog has Buddha nature. But the simplicity of the reply leaves it open as to what he's saying by there is no distinction that a dog does or doesn't have Buddha nature. Even though Mahayana Buddhism clearly says that even like rocks and trees might have Buddha nature plenty. So certainly the dog or cat would. Which is why you shouldn't kill a cat. This is the first koan of the Gateless Gate. The most popular and short, and it's easier to be popular and reprinted as short, Zen koan collection. Like the cat koan, Joshu responds to the negative judgment of animals by casting the situation aside, as Linji calls it, throwing it down a hole. But he managed to make a particular point as well. I have a friend, my friend Justin Lipscomb, who teaches philosophy like myself. I always like to say that he professionally studies nothing. Nothing at all. As he likes to say, he wrote his thesis, his PhD dissertation on nothing. Didn't we all? That thesis, dissertation, etc. That its use in Eastern and Western philosophy as a concept, and people who are into existentialism and Heidegger and the crossover of Eastern and Western, like this, the concepts and the various concepts of non and nothing and all of this. Hegel, specifically in German thought, says that there's many different types of non-being, and that's Plato and that's dialectic. He specifically says a possibility, which is very interesting. I cover some of this in the Greek philosophy this semester. A possibility, let's say it's possible I'll leave my apartment today. Although it's possible I won't because it's the pandemic and I got to make some videos. So that possibility is a kind of non-being. It doesn't exist right now that I've left my apartment, but it's a kind of non-being that potentially exists as a possibility. Yes, in fact, it's kind of tautological and doesn't explain anything by saying a possibility potentially is. That's just different language. So in a certain sense, I am thinking and imagining, as in waking life, if my imagination really thought there was a tiger when I imagine there's a tiger, instead of suspecting maybe there is one and hypothetically leaving it there as a possibility, we'd be a very different species and we'd be freaking out every time we thought about a tiger, as one of the guys in Waking Life says in that movie. So instead of that, as one of the psychonaut guys explains in the dream consciousness that they're sharing, where they're talking about waking, lucid dreaming and trying to experiment with lucid dreaming. So instead of that, what the mind does is it dreams in real life, and you know that you don't know whether or not there's a tiger there or not. And so with all of this, a possibility is in a certain sense me actively dreaming as a reality that could be but isn't now that I'm going to leave my apartment and walk to the store. Which I probably will do. It's not absolutely certain, but it's a non-being that probably will be. Well, think about that. In a certain sense, in order for a child to understand possibilities, we have to train the child to understand there isn't something now, but could be, but isn't yet. And that's what a possibility is. So in other words, a fiction, like Superman being real, is a possibility that can't ever be. And me going to the store is a possibility that probably certainly will be. So here, there's no more reality to Superman than there is me going to the store right now. Because I'm not at the store right now and Superman doesn't exist. But in another sense, in my mind, I understand that possibility I'm going to go to the store is a non-being that could be, but Superman can't. Well, somehow we trick children into understanding all these things, and then the Zen folks are definitely fooling with how we use words and possibilities. So if it seems like my friend studies nothing, and I talk a lot of words that mean nothing at all, these words are mere wind, the peeps of baby birds, according to Shuangzi, the cries of apes for Heraclitus. That's, if you say the dog does not, that is not having Buddha nature, or potentially that's just not a distinction, what are you potentially or actually saying? And there's different kinds of non-being here. Whether or not we're talking about potentialities in the future for the dog at all. We are talking about something like an either-or presently, which is something like non-being either way both, which is kind of like the logic of Nagarjuna. And how do our minds handle these kinds of things? It's the kind of stuff I find endlessly interesting and love talking about. So, what we have here is that the nothingness and emptiness and openness of what we are, as the Taoists would say, mean that my mind is open for the possibility ships cannot sail where the water is too shallow, as Joshu quotes the Zhuangzi Taoist far earlier, 1,000 years plus earlier text. About 1,000 years earlier, actually. 1,100 years or so. And so that non-being and openness of my mind allows the possibility for me to imagine doing several things a day. Otherwise, if my mind was full of certainty, it could not have possibility in it at all. Again, when the hinge is fitted into the socket, it can respond endlessly, as the Taoists say. The monk is trying to decide if a dog is like us, and Joshu uses a single word to circumvent his judgment and leave it in particularly open in a bifurcating way that's actually a very particular type of non-being, thus excluding the judgment and including us and the dog together with Buddha nature in the certainty and possibility of it both. There's a third case involving Xiaoshu and animals. So we have the splitting of the cat, which is actually before Xiaoshu officially has his own place, but is showing off what a young budding genius he is. You then have the case of the dog Buddha nature, which is the first case of the gateless gate. There is a third case, Joshu and animals, which is fantastic. The two water buffalo on Mount Tiantai. Mount Tiantai is the mountain for the Lotus School, if you remember. So this is case 11 of the 48 of the Gateless Gate. Joshu found the sages Kanzan and Jitoju while wandering on Mount Tiantai. So these are people wandering around the same sacred mountain that the Lotus School is from, which is a competing school of Buddhism. And you have these two male sages who kind of live together. Modern scholars have wondered, there's two guys living together. Maybe they're somewhat, doing a different thing. Maybe not. But what Joshu says when he meets them, these two kind of outer-lying geniuses, like Puhua and Linji, but Linji and Joshu have their own places. Puhua and these guys, Kanzan and Jitoju, these guys are sort of crazy sages who sort of don't really even fit in such that they get their own places. These sages on the mountaintop, these independent, arhat-like folks, Joshu says to them when he sees them, "For a long time I have heard about Kanzan and Jitoju." So the text is establishing, by the way, again, these geniuses met up and they're co-establishing each other's awesome Zen amazingness and Taoistic nature, showing us all these geniuses flourishing, which establishes Zen's power, historically. For a long time, I've heard about these famous sages, and now I'm coming to encounter them as one of the patriarchs. But having come here, I just see two water buffalo. The sages put their fingers on their heads like horns. So they're like, okay, water buffalo here. The master waves his arm. Joshu waves his arm and says, "Shoo, shoo, get out of here, you jerks." The sages gnash their teeth like water buffalo, and they're like, "Arr," and they glare at each other, and they don't move. Happy to become water buffaloes when accused, but they don't leave. They just reluctantly, they're like, "Arr." When asked about this later, Joshu laughed heartily and said nothing. Now, if you remember, Linji actually compares Puhua to a donkey, and Puhua brays at him. And Linji called a monk who mooed at him this beast. If you ask these masters an educated scholarly question, you would likely be ridiculed, but if you acted like an untamed animal, you might just meet their approval, or tacitly or otherwise. You might have to interpret it. This Koan Gongan case is very simple and short. In fact, I loved this one, and I quoted it a lot, and it was only when I slowed down, and I've done this stuff in stages where I've actually used to quote these things at students and just leave them as very nonsensical. But then I started over the years slowing down and paying careful attention and trying to do, not spending years staring at these next to a sitting next to a waterfall in meditation, admittedly, but as somebody who does try to not sit in meditation but use Taoist Wu Wei, as these folks also do, to slow down and pay attention to things, and I try to be that disciplined occasionally. If you slow down and you pay attention here, just like the other cases we've been covering, there should be subtle things that are actually obvious, which aren't obvious at first. I very much have been endorsing reading surreal films the same way. Surrealists and modern artists will tell you they are not trying to fool you entirely. They do want people to catch on, so they're not going to be telling you things that are impossible for you to see. If this takes 14 dimensions of chess moves, Edgar Allan Poe, whose work I am going to return to, been talking to awesome people about that lately, says the truth will always be simple and stupid if we know the human heart and the human mind, because the human mind, like Hume would say, the reason is always rooted in and is the slave to the passions. So if the passions are simple and stupid, human beings will be simple and stupid and desirous. So the Zen folk are trying to slap you up and get you to release from your desires. So given that, I have quoted this and been like, they just imitate water buffalo, and then Joshu laughs, that's silly. And definitely the students were like, well, that was weird. It's like, yeah, that's just funny and playful. But if you actually slow down and pay attention to this, it's really quite brilliant. And it's subtly brilliant, which is what makes it so wonderfully brilliant and stupid. We typically, of course, pick humans over water buffalo. So calling two sages water buffalo is insulting. Now, to a Taoist master and a Zen guy, calling Puhua a donkey doesn't matter because he's like, eh. And these guys are like, which is a very similar response. That can't be accidental in the writing up of these texts. even if they end up behaving in opposite ways. So it's innocent and playful, and they respond. These sages and Taoist sages and Zen masters are perfectly happy to be like, okay, now I'm a water buffalo. You know, it's very much like a wizard's duel. A wizard's duel. Now I'm a lizard. Now I'm a germ. Now I'm a dragon. Now I'm whatever I want in the Sword of the Stone Disney movie. It's that I can use my intelligence to get out of this if I can think of a different response and kind of have a battle o' wits, as it's been referred to in ye old ancient times. Haven't had any battles of wits lately, though. You know, none to be seen. So they effortlessly slide in and be like, we're water buffalo now. No problem. Again, if you are a Taoist-like sage or you're a Zen master Taoist-like sage, then of course you could be a water buffalo. No problem. That's just one of the creatures. That's just as good and bad as anybody. Okay, sure. I'm a water buffalo now. We're water buffalo. Why not embrace it? It's very easy to miss that. So that makes the sense. But the interesting thing, and this is how to read, I think, a lot of these koan cases, is that when you watch one move happen, watch for the reversals that happen very subtly right after that, because they're trying to juke any sort of understanding and slip, slide away, slip, slide away. They're trying to shake you and trying to see if you can follow them or not, or if you're paying subtle attention. So what actually happens, if you notice, is Joshu says, yeah, these guys are just water buffalo. So they're like, water buffalo? Mrr. He then says, shoo, shoo, and they stay there and they don't move and are all stubborn. Now, the really funny thing, and this actually hooks very much into Joshu's behavior, and in fact, it's really cool to talk about with Taoism, any sort of holy fool, as well as any kind of humor you like. I like being, I'm an older brother. I have a younger sister. And she's just as smart as I am, which is not smart at all, of course. Quit your fooling, as our great-grandmother would say. So, in a certain sense, if I'm like, I'm a water buffalo now, is that a smart thing to do or a stupid thing to do? Let's say I am Linji and I say, let's cut off the head of the Buddha. He's a criminal, I'm a criminal, great. Now, is that a good or a bad thing to do? Well, if you are teaching people through humor, and if you are a Taoist sage, as I have argued consistently throughout the Taoist stuff, you have the license to bad behavior. Why? Because you are using it as a trickster example, and it doesn't matter how you behave. So what we have here is an incredible play on Taoist-like trickster behavior with these Zen masters. What happens is, and this is the subtle, brilliant thing going on, and for years I quoted this bit and I did not see this at all. He tells them, you guys are water buffalo. Shoo, shoo. And they're like, and they just stand there. They don't go and shoo when he tells them to. Now ask yourself this, are they being good or bad water buffalo right now? Are they being good or bad actors right now? If I play a really bad villain, am I being a good actor? If I behave like an idiot, am I being a good Zen master and am I being a good human? Let's say I'm a good older brother. Should I act like the worst bully or the worst jerk in order to toughen my siblings up or my fellow brothers and sisters up by showing them bad behavior on purpose? One of my favorite routines to do is the straight man routine. I do love the humor of Leslie Nielsen, Colbert, Rodney Dangerfield is somewhat this, is that the straight guy routine. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just a caveman. And what you're doing is you're mocking authority. Colbert's whole career, if you ever watch Strangers with Candy, which is a fantastic show, scared me before I got to high school on Comedy Central. That show is vicious, but it is very much mocking authority and high school films. Let's all go to high school. And mocking authority very brutally is designed to toughen people up, kind of like play fighting, as we've already talked about. So following Taoist trickster behavior and playing on it in these new Chinese amazing Buddhist ways, what you have here is something very subtle, but again, if people clipped this koan case out, this not only establishes, one, that Joshu met with these two genius sages and they interacted, and that shows you Zen is flowering all across the Chan Zen Chinese countryside. But it also is showing you examples of how to be a trickster humorist genius. And what's going on is, when they respond the first time, they are obeying what Joshu asked them to do. They're following him. then when he says shoo, 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 we and Joshu cannot tell whether or not they are doing what he asked them to do, which is like going into a koan case with the master and behaving all crazy and not responding in the way you're supposed to as the way you are supposed to. That what they are doing, which is really brilliant, is by being stubborn cows, they are being good cows, because cows are stubborn. Human beings are stupid. They are idiots. So when they act the good idiot, when they act the good fool, they are being an excellent human being who is highly instructive, like a trickster Taoist sage to their fellow human beings. It is so subtle. It is totally possible people could accuse me of overinterpretation, but here, what simple interpretation. And here again, I'm more than happy, I am not trying to close this out or say I figured it out, no one else does. I think that is the low-hanging fruit right here, where it could be all sorts of other things as well. And when asked about this, Joshu just laughs, because it is kind of like there's just all you can do here is kind of laugh. You can't say, and he is approving of them, because in a certain sense he's approving of them as not approving or disapproving, and he's like, shoo, shoo, you stupid cows, get out of here, which is disapproval behavior. And then you can't approve or disapprove is sort of his laughing response at the end, just kind of a playful laugh, yeah, going along with all of that. In a certain sense, they are being good and bad human beings by being good and bad water buffalo. That is awesome. Okay, also, Nagarjuna. Yes, no, both, and neither. Good human, bad human, as water buffalo, not human, inhuman. Good human, bad human, good water buffalo, both and neither. That is why these short cases are some of the most famous things of Song China. Because of that. That again, I could be accused of overinterpretation. I would, just like with surreal movies I love to interpret, it is not about finding a complicated set of chess moves, as Poe says in his detective stories. It is about what is the simplest, stupidest thing, lying in plain sight, that you would have to have a duck-rabbit reversal to be like, oh, wait a minute. And the better of these, as soon as you have one duck-rabbit reversal patiently, now you can see others. Really, again, I loved these things back in the day. As I have slowly read through them after reading especially the Linji and his sermons, I have started to slowly read these, and I don't think I exhaust them, as I share what I believe are very simple low-hanging fruit and jokes in them that have everything to do with why a Taoist or a Zen practitioner and master would believe that they can act the fool. It's, again, I do think it deserves that lengthy of an interpretation. It certainly does. According to me, most definitely. Now let's see here. How much more do we got? We got quite a little bit, actually, and this is already one talk, which is good. I was wondering whether or not we would finish this off in one talk, and we definitely are going to have enough material here for 2 talks on Joshu, which is quite awesome and perfectly fine with me. So I'm going to stop this talk here. We are at least, I think there will only be possibly 1 talk on each, I have less, there are fewer cases, of the Gateless Gate. I probably will be able to cover the few cases of the Blue Cliff Record and then the Gateless Gate each. The ones we have not already covered, which I am mentioning we're going to cover much of it before we even get to those, because that's the central examples. The Flag Mines Moving example of Hui Neng is one of the central cases of the Blue Cliff Record, I believe. If not the Gateless Gate, I'll have to check through my notes. But I don't have these perfectly memorized. We will get to another talk on Joshu and 1 talk at least, probably just 1 on the Blue Cliff Record cases we have not covered, and then we will have a short talk on the cases of the Gateless Gate we have not covered, and that will hopefully be getting through the talks for the channel on Zen and Buddhist philosophy for now. We will be adding to it continuously in the future, as we do with all of life and existence. So, that said, much happiness. Please do not split any cats apart. Please act like a proper indecent water buffalo. Please learn to speak English words good or ancient Chinese better than I do. And if you speak any Chinese, ancient or modern, you speak it better than I do. So, much happiness, everyone. Hug your local water buffalo. I will find my cats who have somewhat split. And I will see you in the sunlight if I ever see you.